Hello everyone. In this video I want to provide a rotation guide for Condition Virtuoso. I've noticed that my last guide is already a few years old and it was pre-rework of our Dagger 3 and of our F5. So I think it's now time to provide a more updated guidance that will explain how the rotation works. Before we start talking about the rotation, I want to cover a few very important basics that are of interest to players who are new to Condition Virtuoso and perhaps haven't had a chance to try it out yet. So I'm going to talk about what makes this build actually work, and those are the traits. And on Virtuoso, you have two very important traits, and those are the following. There is Jagged Mind, a trait that says blade attacks inflict bleeding on critical hits, and a percentage of your condition damage dealt heals you. You might notice that this trait does not have a cooldown. That means every single blade attack you do will inflict bleeding if you have enough critical chance. So what we're interested about when we look at our skills is that they have this blade attribute in their description that tells you that they trigger this trait. And now we know that we need to critically hit with our Condition Virtuoso in order to trigger this trait as often as possible. This means that in our gear, crit chance will be a very important part of it. And the other important trait is basically the same, but not for us, but for our illusions. So Sharper Images says illusions inflict bleeding on critical hits, and illusions in our case are our Phantasmal Swordsman and our Phantasmal Warden. And you can see when I summon one of these on the enemy, it will actually apply one stack of bleeding for every single hit it does to the golem, which leads to a huge amount of bleeding applications. So we have 9 hits from the Phantasmal Swordsman, and we have actually 12 hits from the Phantasmal Warden. So the entire build revolves around critically hitting, and we need Fury for that to also get 40% crit chance, and then we can apply bleeding. So when we go to a gear, it's important that you actually just copy a gear set from a reputable website to make sure that you have enough critical hit chance. Right now you see I'm at 2110 precision, and this is 45 precision less than we need. In order to reach the crit cap, we want to use buff food that gives us 45 precision. So we take this buff food, and now we are at exactly 60%. If we now have the Fury boon, this brings us to exactly 100%, and it means that our Jagged Mind and our Sharper Images trait will always apply the maximum amount of bleeding, and this leads to the maximum amount of damage. This puts Condition Virtuoso in a quite unique position where you actually want to play with Sinister and Rampager stats in order to reach this high precision value. It's very different from other condition classes that rely more on Viper's gear to buff their expertise. You can see we only have 15% condition duration and just invest a lot of our gear into bleeding. We have the Crate Runes, we have the Sigil of Agony, and then we have the Relic of the Aristocracy, which gives us 15% more condition duration to just bring us to the cap of 100% bleeding duration and 30% other durations. Now, one of the big payoffs we have for applying bleeding is this trait Bloodsong. And it says bleeding you apply deals increased damage, and you stock a blade after applying enough stacks of bleeding to foes. And it's important that this bleeding doesn't have to go to a single foe. if you cleave 2 ads at once or 2 enemies at once, you just gain double the blades, basically. So Virtuoso gets quite a bit stronger, at least in the blade generation department, when it has a chance to cleave enemies. And you need 5 bleeding stacks per blade. And for this reason, all these skills that apply bleeding also produce blades, obviously. So if I press a Phantasmal Warden here, you will see how my blades just go up, go up, go up from all the bleeding that Phantasmal Warden has applied. Now, due to our traits causing most of the damage, it's actually very difficult to recognize how much damage these skills actually are doing because they're not really telling you in the tooltip any of it. So I've made this table where I show how much damage each skill does and how many blades they produce as well, so you can have a good overview. And I'll put it in the top left corner for the rest of this video, so you always have this quick reference guide. Maybe one thing to explain about it is how Flying Cutter works, our auto attack. And the way it works is the following. You use it twice, and then the third use summons 3 extra tiny blades. This is so-called the flurry damage, and these are just 3 extra hits. And because as a Condi Virtuoso, we are just interested in number of hits, because each hit produces 1 bleeding stack, this third attack is actually super strong compared to the first 2. And so since every third auto hit is especially strong, I decided to average out this third damage to every single hit, and you can see in that sense that each auto attack on average produces 0.4 blades, because on average it applies 2 bleeding stacks. And then you can just look at the rest of the table and also see how the bleeding stacks and the damage map to the blades generated. All right, now that we've covered these basics, it's time to take a look at some gameplay. So as a first part, I want to give you a brief rotation overview. This is more aimed at beginners, and afterwards we will talk about slightly more advanced concepts. The key structure that we have to understand when we play Condition Virtuoso is our weapon swaps. We start on the sword set with a sword 5 ability, and now we have 2 choices. First choice would be to stay on the sword ability set, to use our dagger 2, and maybe use some more abilities here before weapon swapping. The second choice is to weapon swap immediately to the focus set and use focus 5 Phantasm there, because it's a very strong ability. These are main 2 options we have at the moment. Now, when you think about this, is that we realize that everything we want to do afterwards here, for example, using our dagger 2, could also be done on the focus set. So even if we decide that dagger 2 is the correct ability to use next, there's no reason for us to right now stay on the sword set. So let's do that weapon swap and use our focus ability. So here we can have both. We had the dagger 2, and now we can use focus. The advantage of swapping early is that this started a weapon swap cooldown. And with this weapon swap cooldown of 10 seconds, we are now locked out of sword for 10 seconds. But it's better to lock yourself out immediately after you cast your sword 5, because it means the next sword 5 can come earlier. Imagine for a second that after this sword 5, had we waited maybe 5 more seconds on the sword set and done some other things, then this would mean our next sword 5 would be delayed by that much amount of time, right? It's not just delaying our focus ability, which is also a bad idea because focus 5 is so good, but it's also delaying our next sword 5 in line due to the weapon swap cooldown. So whenever you use a sword 5 ability, you basically want to weapon swap to focus as soon as you can. And now you see that at the end of focus, I also swapped to sword as soon as I was able. Then on the sword set, I first used the sword 5 ability to put it on cooldown as soon as possible. And now that the weapon swap is available, obviously I don't weapon swap now. I want to use sword 5 once more. But once I have used it, now I want to swap immediately. Again, with the logic that if I delay the swap by more seconds, that means that I'm going to cast my next sword 5 later. And we don't want to cast them late, we want to cast them as often as possible. On the focus set, we want to use focus 5 and the healing ability to reset the focus 5 so we can cast it again. And then once we're done, we swap back to sword and do the same sword 5 logic. In between all of that, you use your Bloodsongs F1, F2 and F5 as often as you can, as well as your dagger 2, dagger 3. If every Bloodsong is on cooldown, we can also use our Signet of Illusions to reset all of those. So you can see now we put this F5 on cooldown, and now we can use our Signet of Illusions to use all the shatters again. Understanding this Signet of Illusion reset in full is quite complicated, and we will talk about it later in the video. For now, it just suffices to keep this as a little reminder. Signet of Illusions can be used to reset the shatters, and if you use it to reset F2, F5 and F1, then you've done a good job already. Because these shatters do a lot of damage, so if you're able to use them more often, that's good for your damage. But during all of that, you can't forget about the basic mechanism of the rotation, and that is really these weapon swaps with focus 5, heal skill focus 5, and sword 5 of cooldown. And weapon swapping back to focus again. Now that we've had this basic overview, I think it's also time for you to take a moment to practice just this baseline. Because if you get these basics right, you can already do a lot of damage without even anything fancy like Signet of Illusion concepts or any particular set skill order. Just understanding that you weapon swap after every sword 5, or after every second sword 5 rather, and that you weapon swap as soon as you can once you're done with everything on focus. Just by doing that, you already gain a lot of damage. And even though many players tell me that they understand this idea, when you go look at their gameplay, their logs in fights, etc., you can always see people deviate from this idea. And yes, of course, there are mechanics that happen and so on, so this can distract you. However, you already see this deviation in the opening of players. So you would see players who will cast their first sword 5 as they should, but then they just stay on that set for 5 more seconds, use their dagger 2, use another shatter, use their elite skill, something like that, and only then swap to focus. So this mistake of not understanding or not being able to execute this weapon swap pattern isn't just made up. Like this problem a lot of people have. And sometimes even in like posted gameplay in videos, etc., that people don't weapon swap properly. So this is a very foundational skill that you need to learn, and it's quite a bit harder than it looks, and you should probably practice it a little bit on the golem, but also in actual fights. All right, now that we've done that, we can take a look at more advanced concepts. And I think the best way to go about learning the rotation is really to just take a look at how it works bit by bit. So we will go through the whole 93 seconds of the benchmark now, and I will make some comments on each section of the rotation and explain the main ideas behind it. In order to understand the opener, I first want to take a look at what the ideal state of a rotation roughly looks like. And for that, we're going to play the first 10 seconds of the opener, and then I will hit pause once we're done with it. So now I use Signet of Illusions, I use all the Bloodsongs. And now let's take stock at this moment in time, because this is what I would describe as the ideal situation for a DPS build to be in. You can see on my DPS meter, even though I'm a Condi build, I'm already doing 42,000 DPS or 41.9k. And this is an ideal state because we have put every single ability that matters, our focus 5, our Sword 5, our healing ability, Signet of Illusions, Elite Skill, Dagger 2, Dagger 3, all the Bloodsong, we've put everything on cooldown. Now, of course, the F1 is right now not fully on cooldown. It's an ammo ability, so it has 2 charges. But since it's not at 2 charges right now, it's also recovering its cooldown. So we're now at a point where every single DPS ability is recovering cooldown. This means that right now, we have done as much as we can as a DPS player. Now it's only time for auto attacks. And whenever one of these abilities comes back, we can simply use it and put it on cooldown again. So right now, Alacrity, the boon that refreshes our cooldowns faster, and time in general is in our favor because we gain damage more or less for every single second that passes now. We will have all these cooldowns refreshing, which brings us closer to casting them again. Compare this with a situation, maybe here, towards the start, where we still have so many things we haven't used yet. At this moment, time is only helping us to refresh our Dagger 3 and our F5, but not our other abilities. And if we take a look at the situation before we even started, so maybe here, before we even started, this is the exact opposite of the ideal state. So the moment before this opener starts is the worst moment for a DPS player. And once the opener is done, is basically the ideal state. And now the question is, how quickly, or what is the quickest way to get from this state where all skills are available and passing time doesn't boost our damage to a state where everything is on cooldown and passing time recovers all cooldowns at once? And how can we make this transition as efficiently as possible? And this task, putting everything on cooldown, is what is the main goal of an opening rotation. And basically every single class in the game has a set opener that you should be using. And Condition Virtuoso is no different. Even though you have a lot of freedom in what you're doing normally, and Virtuoso has a lot of basically equivalent concepts, I strongly believe that this opener at least is something you should learn to do skill by skill and not just have some vague ideas on priority as we had it before with, yeah, you use a sword 5, then weapon swap, but actually think about the skill order and maybe perhaps copy the skill order I'm going to present you now. So, because putting everything on cooldown is not as easy as it sounds, because it automatically begs the question, which is the highest priority skill? A lot of players say that they like priority lists, but in truth, these priority lists are the most useless piece of information you could have now, because priority lists often base themselves on which skill is the strongest skill, as in, does it do the most damage? Does it do the most damage per cast time, maybe, if you want to be more sophisticated? So like, you would get this priority list and you would maybe conclude that your Focus 5 is the strongest ability. Or your F2 does 46,000 damage, that is very strong, so you should just use it first, right? But when you watch the benchmark, you will see that I actually use my F2 pretty late into this opening sequence. So there's more to priority, and now we want to unravel this in the next bits of this video. What happens first in our quest to put things on cooldown? There are certain stuff we can put on cooldown even before the fight starts. This is a big advantage we can build because the fighting time hasn't started yet, and we already spent the cast time on these skills. That's the reason why we use our Dagger 3 as the first ability. Even though it's not our strongest ability, it's not highest priority in that sense, but once we cast it, it takes about half a second to cast it. Once we cast it, it takes another second for it to start pulsing damage. So it's actually just a free skill to place this whirlwind on the ground without starting the combat timer. This is a precast you can do in many raid bosses as well to just look better on the DPS meter, and you should probably go do it as well. It isn't just good for DPS, it's also good for blade production, etc. So yeah. And now the next part in the logic is that we use our Sword 5 ability. Sword 5 has a cast time of 880 milliseconds, or 0.88 seconds. And only after 3/4 of that, roughly, do we actually get put into combat with a physical strike against the golem. Our character will strike with us with the sword and give us 8 might. So we use this ability, Sword 5, to enter combat as late as possible. Again, not because it somehow has priority, because it would be very strong, but just because of its long cast time, making it beneficial to start with it. So the cast can happen before combat starts, and we don't have to spend that amount of time inside combat, because that would, again, mean we delay other skills functionally. And once we've done that and we swapped weapon, we now have a choice on what to do next. And the answer to that question is, again, not to use our ability that does the highest damage, which in this situation would be our Focus 5 Phantasm, but rather also take a look at cooldowns of abilities. Let's say our Dagger 2 was used as the last ability once everything else has been put on cooldown. That does make sense because it's the lowest damage skill we have. It only does about 26,000 damage or 30,000 damage, something like that. Whereas the other abilities are all massively stronger, like the Focus 5, which is about 58,000 damage, or the Shatters, which are 40,000 damage each. And imagine we put it last. Now, this means we delay the Dagger 2. It has a 4-second cooldown. We delay this by about 4 seconds. It takes that much time until we've cast Focus 5, Heal Skill, Focus 5, F1 maybe. That's already more than 2 seconds. So we delay it by 2 seconds, which is about half the cooldown, which means it costs us about half a use of a Dagger 2 ability, which is a big damage loss. On the other hand, if you put the Dagger 2 first here, and only then use these abilities, all that happens to the other abilities is that we delay them by the cast time of a single Dagger 2, which in relation to their longer cooldown, the healing Signet has 25 seconds cooldown. In relation to the 25 seconds it takes to recharge this, delaying it by another half second for the Dagger 2 first is only a very tiny delay and very tiny DPS loss as a consequence. In the end, we're going to use our healing Signet 4 times during the benchmark. And we will do that regardless whether we use it now first or we use it after we've done the Dagger 2. This half a second delay doesn't change anything about that. However, on the other hand, if you put the Dagger 2 last and delay it by 2 seconds, this has a very high chance, 50%, because it's 50% is half the cooldown of the thing, the 50% chance of costing us a full Dagger 2 cast. So this is a cost that is associated with delaying the Dagger 2, but it's not a cost associated with delaying the healing ability or the Focus 5 here. So we have to think a bit bigger than just the damage or the damage per cast time. Cooldowns are also important, and as a very rough rule of thumb, it can be a very good idea to use low cooldown abilities first. But again, this is not a general rule. but it just as a concept, it allows you often to cast these low cooldown abilities more often in the end, and that's why we like to put them first. Here at this moment, I'm actually using the Dagger 2 first, not just for this reason, so it is on cooldown sooner and we can use it more often during the golem benchmark, but also because generating a blade right now is very important. We have a resource game with our blades here. And what would happen if I press these buttons first, I still need to Dagger 2 before I can use my next shatter anyway. So I'm using it now, so the blades have time to fly out. The blades have time to return even to give us more blades when we need them. And now you may ask, okay, but if this Dagger 2 is so important, why did I not use it earlier? Why didn't I not use it before here? And here, obviously, the competing interest is this idea of the longer cast time outside of combat that the Sword 5 has. And so yeah, that's why I didn't start with a Dagger 2 here. And one more thing that I can say about these first few seconds is, you notice I use my weakest Bloodsong first. And this has two reasons. One reason is, because of Signet of Illusions, it doesn't actually matter which Bloodsong we start with, except we could use F1, which would also be a reasonable idea. But anyway, the other thing is that while we try to put everything else on cooldown, it's probably best to use the one Bloodsong that doesn't have a cast time. You see, if I pressed F1 here, I would delay Dagger 2 and Focus 5 and Heal Skill by the cast time of a F1 ability, which is like 0.64 seconds that I just delay this by. However, if I use an instant cast ability, this can happen during the cast of these abilities. And so by just pressing F5 here, and I can put everything here on cooldown already first, and only once I'm done with it, I use the other Bloodsongs, which also have a cast time. And this is a gain because I can only use one Bloodsong in that first moment anyway, so I make it the one that doesn't have a cast time. All right. So now that I've used Dagger 2 here, and I can now use my Focus 5, I can use my healing ability. And now the next idea comes. The question is now whether I should use my F1 or should I use my Focus 5? And this is also an interesting question that tells you a lot about priority. Damage-wise, our Focus 5 is much stronger than the Bloodsongs. However, what you see here is the cooldown of the healing ability. The healing ability has a 30-second cooldown, 25 with alacrity. And I'm going to use it again to reset the cooldown of the Focus 5 eventually, right? So once it comes back up, I will use it again to regain the cooldown. And at that moment, it doesn't actually matter how quickly I use the previous Focus 5. You see, Focus 5 has a cooldown of 16 seconds by itself, 20 seconds without alacrity, 16 seconds with alac. And even if I use the Focus 5 instantly now, then we loop around once more, we go to sword, 2 sword skills, and then go back to focus. I can use my Focus 5 again, but then my healing skill is still on a 5-second cooldown or something like that. And I will use the healing skill then and reset the cooldown of the Phantasmal Warden anyway, of the Focus 5. So nothing is gained by speeding up the first cast of the Focus 5. Right now I can actually wait with this Focus 5 until I have nothing else to do. Nothing that would be more important. So at this moment, even though Focus 5 is stronger than the F1, we choose to press the F1. And the reason for the F1 will become apparent when we cast the Signet of Illusions. Let's talk about it a bit later. Alright, so we go Focus 5, F1, Elite Skill. Now the Elite Skill is also an instant cast. It's like the F5, I could have used it at any point during this opener, I chose to use it here for two reasons. Reason number one is we have a lot of blade consumption right now because we still have blade songs that need to be filled. I need 5 blades per blade song. This costs 5. This costs 5, and we have 2 charges here that we want to get rid of. That's 20 blades we want. Then we use Signet of Illusions, get a reset on all these 3 for another 5, 5, and 5. So 35 blades we need in this opener. And the blades I need the most during this period here where it's very tight. So that's the moment I want to use 1000 cuts. 1000 cuts will apply 10 stacks of bleeding, which results in 2 blades produced. And I want them at this moment now, so I use it now. Delaying a skill like this is obviously bad for your damage, right? You could do more DPS if you use it earlier. At least temporarily, you would do more burst, for example. However, we plan ahead. We know that the fight is 93 seconds, roughly, and it has a 60-second cooldown, 48 with alacrity. So even if I used it at the very start, it would not come off cooldown a 3rd time, or for a 3rd use. We only can use it twice. This means we can just delay it by 3 seconds, without changing the frequency with which we can cast it. This is the same idea as with the healing skill, where I also said that, well, it doesn't have to be pressed right now at the very start, because with its long cooldown, it's unlikely that delaying it will actually reduce your use of the ability during the fight. And on the other hand, a relatively short cooldown ability needs to be pressed immediately in order to guarantee it comes to maximum use during a whole fight. And Elite skill with double the cooldown of the healing ability is obviously the extreme version of that. We can delay it or nothing here just to smoothen out the opener and cover our blade needs in this very tight timing. Okay, we use the F1 next, and you see that I use it actually when I still have 3 blades only, but I do know that I will get the sorry, that was already, the F1 was already used. Yeah, let's rewind. Okay, I used the F1 while I still have 3 or 4 blades. I use it, focus 5, and also use my F2 when I only had 3 blades, but I knew that they would fill up in time to 5. And then I use once more my F1. And here's another crucial point. Actually, you see me delay my dagger 2. It would be up now, but I make sure to use my F1 first before I use the dagger 2. The reason for that is that after the Signet of Illusions, we still need blades, and dagger 2 is so efficient at generating blades, it gives 2.2 blades once it's fully done. This actually enables us to go Signet of Illusions into F2. Like you see, like we generated 5 blades seemingly while channeling Signet of Illusions. All right. Now let's take a brief look why we chose to prioritize F1 over the F2. And the reason is now that you see Signet of Illusions only recharges 1 ammo charge of the F1 ability. That means the F1 keeps recharging here. Had I used the F2 first before, so if I opened here with an F2 rather than F1, here, if I used F2 rather than F1 here, what would have happened is that F1 starts recharging later. And remember, for the Signet of Illusion, it fully resets the F2. It doesn't matter when you put the F2 on cooldown. But I can wait with it a little bit. As long as I do it before I press Signet of Illusion, it's fine. So by pressing F1 now, its recharge starts working. And because I consume the second charge before the reset, this means now that the cooldown regeneration of the F1 is already recovered until here, and I very soon will get a new charge, a second charge, whereas if had I started with the F2 ability instead and delayed the F1 before, the recharge would only be about here. Like it would be 3 seconds later or 2 seconds later maybe. So I would actually, the F1 is the only of the Bloodsong cooldowns that I can carry over the use of a Signet of Illusions. And for that reason, it makes so much sense to put the F1 first. I just don't want to be it to be the very first cooldown because of all the other considerations with other competing cooldowns and cast times at the start that I've already talked about. So, and now that we are after the Signet reset, I also don't want to use my F1 for a very similar reason than before, but just the other way around. Now the F1 is still recharging. We're still gaining something because even though it has 1 ammo, it isn't capped out. So at this moment, even though it would be a very potent skill with a very low cooldown as well, we can actually afford to let it sit a bit more until that cooldown has refreshed all the way to here. And before it comes off cooldown, obviously. And first use our F2 ability. So we use that. And now, only now, does it make sense once it approaches, does it make sense to put actual effort into pressing F1. We don't use F5 right now. And we're going to see why in 40 seconds of the video. Before the second Signet of Illusions, it will make sense. Now we're already in a very comfortable position. Like we partially solved our opening problem, where we have many different competing abilities that are ready. Now they've been used once at least, and they're coming off cooldown and becoming ready again, 1 by 1 only, because they all have different cooldowns, and the rotation is arranged in a way to avoid as many cooldown collisions as possible. So we will rarely ever have 2 skills come off cooldown at the same time. This means that from now on, there aren't actually any decision points in the rotation anymore. Or there are some, I will talk about them. But for most of the rotation, what you can do now is only press buttons as they become ready again. And you don't have to think about priorities anymore in any way. So let's rewind a bit. We go from here, where we have lots of competing interests, because every single skill wants to be put on cooldown as soon as possible. And I've explained how that sort of works out, which one we want to use first because of a precast. And then we want to put a low cooldown skill on cooldown. And then the heavy hitters, we can delay a focus 5. We want to choose our F1 over the F2, etc. We've gone over all this. And this is a very difficult decision point. And to be honest, a point where knowing a priority list, like which skill is the strongest or whatever, having priorities doesn't help you here. What you need here is a precise concept, like an exact order of skills. And there's that one order that is the best, hopefully. And after this is done, after we put all of those on cooldown, use a Signet reset, we again don't need a priority list. What we need now is we just press the skills as they come off cooldown. The biggest collision you'll have from now on is you only have like 1 or 2 abilities coming, or 2 abilities coming up at the same time. That might be possible. And then you use one and then the other. And whichever you choose, the other one will be delayed by roughly half a second. And half a second is not a lot. So no matter how you choose, the DPS loss from a wrong choice will be measured like in tens of DPS, maybe 100 DPS difference. So the choices that we have from now on, they are not relevant. They're not difficult to make because for the most part, there's only 2 skills colliding. Pick one. Go with your gut feeling. Obviously, in the benchmark, I have a very specific plan, and I'm going to talk about that plan as well in the later part of the video. But if you manage to follow the idea so far and understand that this rotation order in the opener is very useful in setting up the rest, you can also just learn this part and then transition to the rest by just pressing skills as they come back off cooldown. You don't need a priority list for that second part either. So priority lists are really useless for the opener, and they're also really useless for the rest of the rotation. And that's kind of why I totally disagree with everyone who always pushes priority lists as some kind of useful tool to understand Condition Virtuoso at the least. I think here they're out of place, and I would much rather teach the opener precisely and then make people understand this weapon swap concept. All right. Now that we've swapped to sword, the highest priority skill here is sword 5, obviously. And the reason for that is not its damage output, it's that using it first lets you get another sword 5 at the end as soon as possible. If you use other abilities first, you can do that. The problem is that it reduces how often you can use your sword 5 by 1, much like how delaying your dagger 2 can reduce how often you use dagger 2 over the course of the benchmark. So at this moment, press the sword 5 once you've swapped back to sword. And now was the point where I used my F5. And the thing about the F5 is that it has roughly 25-second cooldown, about 20 seconds with alacrity. And this means we can use it 3 times before our next Signal of Illusions. This was the first time now. We can't use it 4 times no matter how much priority we put on it, because 20 times 3 is 60 seconds, so you don't get an extra user out of it, even if you press it perfectly. That's why you put it last, even after the F1. So since you know that this Signal of Illusion is coming up again, it makes total sense to just delay this F5. And now we just press buttons off cooldown. Here you have a small collision. You have dagger 2 and dagger 3 theoretically coming off cooldown at basically the same time. It's not quite the same. You see a small difference. But even if they came up at the same time, for you, that sometimes can happen depending on what you do. It doesn't matter that much. I would personally prefer placing the dagger 2 on cooldown first, simply because relatively to its cooldown, cast time of dagger 3 is more significant than the other way around. So again, delaying dagger 2 here costs you more uses of dagger 2. And we also have some blade generation down the line that relies on having dagger 2 available, which it might not be if we use dagger 3 first here. Alright, so I would go dagger 2 first on this collision. And now we have another collision between F2 and sword 5. And again, we have to weigh this F2 against the Signet of Illusions here. Technically, you could delay the F2 until the next weapon set. Problem with that is, if you delay your F2 here by 2 seconds more, then its last use will collide with the last use of F5 before the Signet of Illusions. So with this in mind, I would try to put the F2 on cooldown before the sword 5, even though delaying sword 5 is not good. We would lose more from having these two abilities collide here. Bloodsongs colliding have a bigger problem than weapon skills colliding. Weapon skills colliding mean that one weapon skill comes half a second later, minimal loss. Bloodsongs colliding means one Bloodsong comes about 3 seconds later, because you need to, after using one, you need to generate 5 blades again, right? So for this reason, we do things in this rotation to avoid Bloodsong collisions more often than we do things to avoid weapon skill collisions. So yeah, I put F2 first and then sword 5, even though it means a small delay. We will regain the time from this delay in about 60 seconds of the benchmark, so towards the end. We can recover this. I will show how. And now, again, it's just putting skills on cooldown as soon as they become ready again. And because we've done this opener so carefully, it's really no collisions or almost no collisions. The healing ability, dagger 2, dagger 3. And here again is a collision between dagger 2 and sword 5. And this time, we actually need the pace from the sword 5 first. If we went dagger 2 first, we would not gain that much because a later dagger 2 is slightly delayed for the purpose of generating a blade exactly when we need it. So if we went dagger 2 first here, it would not really benefit us as much as going second with it. And then once this is resolved, again, it's just with the future in mind, we see our F2 is coming, so we use F2. F1 is not that important because it is an ammo ability. F3 doesn't do much damage, so it is not important. So it's just very simple. And now there's a near collision, but actually, even though we went with the sword 5 first before, and only after the dagger 2, now they are flipped, and we can cleanly use the dagger 2 before the sword 5. And it's not actually a loss. You see, there's 0.7 seconds on that cooldown remaining, and that dagger 2 is ready already. So no delay happening here. And when we get back to the focus set, you see this idea of the focus phantasm and the healing ability. We could have waited longer with the focus phantasm without any problem. The reason I'm using it here is that it's generally a good idea to gain blades now. The way we're going to provoke this is that we get the focus phantasm to die at the opportune moment, then it converts itself into one blade. So if I use it now rather than in, let's say, 5 seconds, which we could do, we actually gain its blades during a more useful time window. Even though, yeah, the healing signet cooldown makes it not that relevant to use it right now. All right, no choices here. We can use an F1, dagger 2, no choices here, F2. And the second elite use is again, we're approaching the Signet of Illusions. We have a high blade consumption. We still need to get an F1 in. We need to get an F5 in. And then we Signet of Illusions. And we need to get all these shatters in once more, which is costing us a total of 25 blades. So we use the 1000 cuts here to make sure that we have the blades that we need. We could also wait with it a few more seconds. It just makes the next Bloodsong a bit riskier. So for consistency of the benchmark, I started using it at this moment here. All right. Now, what was interesting here is that I went with the F1 first before the dagger 2. Even though dagger 2 was also ready. This is a small delay. And the reason I'm doing this is that I was already at 5 blades when I pressed the F1. The dagger 2's blade generation would have went to waste. And it would have, and now it helps actually refill our blades because we still need to get an F5 in. And this is actually quite challenging to gain 5 blades in this very small time window. We use a dagger 2, a focus 5, and 3 auto attacks. And by that moment, we want to have F5 ready. So we can weapon swap and then Signet reset. And you see, with the help of that dagger 2, this now worked and we were able to get to 5 blades and use it. And now weapon swap. Sword 5, delaying the pace wouldn't be a good idea here. And now Signet of Illusions with all the shadows on cool. Yeah, so as you were able to see here, F2 could have been delayed more, but had we delayed it more earlier, it would have collided with this very tight window of time where we have to actually use all the other Bloodsong as they come up. So we avoided successfully this collision and made this to this very tiny window Let's just watch it once more. It's very difficult to produce the blades we need for this. And now we reset. And after this reset, we have to again go by logic of what we want to do next. Our F1 still has time over, so we don't need to press it now. We can use our F2 first. Our F5 first would be an idea. And we would do that if we had a lot of skills ready. Like if we still had sword 5 and healing skill, for example, then it would make sense to go for the instant cast chatter. But here, since we don't have that, we go for F2 because it's our strongest chatter. Using it now will actually mean that about 10 seconds before the golem dies, we get one last F2 in, so that's a gain. And going F5 now would not gain us any F5 uses at the end. So here we put really priority on the F2. It does a lot of damage. That's also a plus. It does a bit more than our F5, for example. And we do it because we get to use it more often in the end. And after that, we go with our dagger 2 to recover blades. And again, dagger 2 will be ready already. The reason we're not using it is that not using it before the F2 is really that we want the blades when we have 0 blades and not when we are maxed out on blades. So we use it now, and now we can immediately F1 again. At this moment, I want to use my F1 and not my F5, because even though the F1 is not quite full, by the time we could otherwise use it, it would be capped out. And again, putting priority on F5 doesn't gain us an extra use. However, using the F1 now and avoiding its cooldown overflow means that the final F1 we're going to use in the fight still has a chance to do almost full damage to the golem. So F1 next. And then we just have to wait until blades are generated. And at this moment, we don't have a lot of things that generate blades anymore. We have this illusionary warden that you can see here. It's from our focus 5, which when it despawns will give us a blade. And we have some pulsing damage still going on. But then we just have to auto attack. So generating this last set of blades was quite a bit slower. And here you see that would have been the problem if he didn't go for F1 before. It would have definitely overflowed on his cooldown. So it was a good choice here to wait with the F5. And now that it has been pressed, again, we don't really have choices. We just go 3-2. And once sword 5 is ready, we sword 5 weapon swap. And now we have a major collision. And this collision is quite unfortunate. I have not found a way around it. Everything we've done so far leads up to this problem here. And it's not avoidable. We want to use dagger 2, dagger 3, and F2. And all at the same time. And here you really have to play towards what is most important to you. And what we're going to try is in 5 seconds of the benchmark, like 5 seconds later, we would like to weapon swap to sword to use our sword 5. If you do that as fast as we can actually get 2 more sword 5s in before the golem dies, which is huge. And the problem is, if I go F2 into dagger 3 into dagger 2, for example, if I put the dagger 2 last, the next dagger 2 will come up exactly at the moment when we want to weapon swap. And this would mean that we either delay the dagger 2 by another second or even 2 seconds, because it also collides with the healing ability, or that we delay the weapon swap for the dagger 2. And if we delay the weapon swap for the dagger 2 that significantly, it means we get the sword 5 later. And if you get the sword 5 later, the next sword 5 is later and doesn't get to do damage anymore to the golem. So at this moment, the logic of trying to avoid cooldown collisions dictates that we go with a dagger 2 first. And only then we use the other skills, even though they're more powerful. Again, delaying those by half a second is not that big of a deal. Delaying this by 2 seconds due to a collision down the line costs us half a dagger 2 use. And half a dagger 2 use is a bigger loss than tiny losses there. So dagger 2 first, F2, then dagger 3. And now we have not much left, but here we get the dagger 2 again. This is our price. Had we delayed it, the Signet would have been off cooldown at the same time, but we didn't make that mistake. So now we can dagger 2 into the heal Signet, into the focus 5. And you see now how tight this is. At this moment, our weapon swap is ready. That means every single moment we wait from now on is a moment that we're not casting Sword 5. It's costing us damage. Sword 5 is ready. It needs to be cast now. And we still spend time on this weapon set. So rearranging the order and making dagger 2 collide with Signet would mean that the dagger 2 would have to be cast now, maybe, as to not delay it much further. And that's just half a second lost on the next Sword 5. So this avoiding the collision earlier now reaps benefits. Then we go to Sword, use Sword 5, F1. We're about 15 seconds from Golem death. Now we have to start think about how conditions work. Most of our conditions last between 7 and 10 seconds that we apply. So you can now no longer expect abilities to do their full damage very soon, at least. For example, a Sword 5 here still does full damage. It takes about 3 or 4 seconds to do its Phantasm attack, and then the condis can tick for another 10 seconds before the golem dies. It's very good that we get this Sword 5 in still here. But the next Sword 5 obviously will not be able to do that anymore, and we rely more on the strike damage of it. And this means that the ending of a golem bench for a condi class is actually not that impactful anymore. Like the main skills have been cast now. Obviously, we still push skills of cooldown, but like the main damage has been done. Now we're just ending the fight somehow. But still, you can do good decisions for a bit of extra burst towards the end. But you just have to keep in mind this little fact. And now that we use a F5, for example, F5 takes 5 seconds to apply stuff, and then those condis tick for 10 seconds still. So this is already not full value anymore. And here we make a choice. We have here a collision between our F1 and our F2. Using the F1 here might mean in some situations, especially if we put priority on the F2 earlier, but which we didn't, might mean a collision between these two skills where you can't use the other one immediately. But since the golem is at 9% health right now, it's going to die in about 8 seconds. Waiting 2 seconds here so I can use the F2 first, just because it does more damage in total, would mean that the F2 only gets to do damage for 6 more seconds maybe, and then the F1 after that is even more ineffective. So here, it is better to use the weaker skill earlier, just so it can tick for longer, and it can get more of its condis in before the golem dies. And only then will we go for the F2. Yeah, just to maximize our damage, basically. So now you see there's a small delay because we don't quite have the blades yet to do an F2. And that is fine. And now is the last Sword 5 that is coming. The Sword 5 Phantasm, the bleeds will not tick anymore, but it still does a lot of strike damage, which makes it still valuable. We use one more dagger too, but now it's important we only use auto attacks here. Even though we would gain our F1 and our dagger 3 very soon, even had we used our dagger 3 earlier with higher priority, like 15 seconds ago, we delayed it a little bit during the last collision, this would not get us our dagger 2 to get any more value in, because if you get a dagger 3, would not get us our dagger 3 to get more value in. If you get our dagger 3 at the last second, it takes 1 full second to even start ticking. And then it takes 4 seconds to apply all its condis, and then another 10 seconds to fully apply bleeds. So this small delay of a dagger 3 that costs us a dagger 3 use technically here, but this is 0 DPS loss, because it's way too slow as an ability when the golem is at 1%. So actually you end the golem just auto-attacking. You're also not swapping weapons to focus anymore, because the focus phantasm is not ready, and it would also take more than 15 seconds to start doing damage, its full damage. So yeah. That is, in a nutshell, all the decision making that goes into this golem. Now that I'm done explaining the rotation, I want to talk about a few more topics, but you should treat those as footnotes. So if you just want the maximum result from practice, you should now go watch my opening guide and practice the opening to enable you to then follow along the rotation in full. But if you're just interested in a few more details, because you maybe already know the opening perfectly, this part of the video is just for you to learn about a few more things. First thing is that I'm going to, whenever I start a golem, I'm going to actually swap the trait Bloodsong out and then swap it back in. The reason for this is that this counter of Bloodsong that gives you a blade every 5th bleeding stack keeps counting even if you're out of combat. And what I want to do is I want to start with the counter at 0 to make the benchmark more consistent, to make the blade generation more consistent. You don't have to do this if you don't care about sometimes losing 50 DPS to bad RNG because you only have a Bloodsong with 4 blades at some points. I just did it for consistency. Next thing is actually a very important concept that comes into play after the opening is done. And that is the concept of holding down skill keys in order to queue them up. And you can see it for the first time in action here, or rather here. You will sometimes see this message skill recharging on the screen. And this happens because I'm holding down a key that is currently on cooldown. Right now I'm pressing dagger 3, or I have already pressed it. But what I'm going to do next, now that the dagger 3 is being executed, is I'm going to hold down the 2 skill. What this does is the following. It will cast the skill as soon as it is available, as soon as it's off cooldown, but it does respect your current action. So it only queues it up after your current action is complete. Now, normally, if I just pressed it a single time here, it would complain that it's skill recharging and not execute it after. But by holding, it will input spam it so often that it will just cast it immediately, basically perfectly. However, if I were to use an auto attack after this dagger 3 and was in the process of casting that auto attack, dagger 2, even if I hold down the key, would wait until the auto attack is fully completed. So holding keys that are of skills that are currently on cooldown allows you not only to perfectly queue up those skills, but it also allows you to make sure that the auto attack before the skill is still finished perfectly. So this greatly reduces the amount of skill you need to not cancel auto attacks. And so maybe we see it a bit better in action a bit later, but whenever you see skill recharging flash, it's actually because I'm holding down a key. Here, for example, I'm using my dagger 2 by holding it, but I have no idea of knowing if my dagger 3 is actually ready after the dagger 2 is done, or if there's an auto attack in between, ideally. So what I did was I'm just holding 3 right now, And what the game does, it starts an auto attack because it wasn't ready. It was off by maybe 40 milliseconds. And now this auto attack, even though I'm holding 3, is being completed fully before I execute the 3. So I get a full auto attack and then only the 3. And learning this trick of holding down keys allowed me to greatly reduce the number of mistakes I'm making while playing. And it's really, really useful. It takes a bit of time to get used to. And there's also a problem with it I will talk about a bit later. But if you want to execute a perfect rotation, maybe this is something you want to look into which skills you can hold down in which situation. And one fun application is, and this may be news to many people who play Mesmer, you know that your healing skill cancels abilities, right? But if you hold down healing skill here, I'm only auto-attacking until I cast it. So I can hold it down all the way here. That's why you see the skill recharging complete. If you hold it down like that, then it will just queue up perfectly after this auto-attack. Like there was just an auto-attack that was still completed. So healing skill will not actually cancel abilities if you hold it down, which is great. Like this is such a big stress factor for players that they accidentally cancel abilities. And with this trick, you can just stop canceling stuff. So yeah, it's not just auto attacks being cancelled by skills, but also skills being cancelled by a heal skill that you can avoid this way. However, there's 2 limits to this. First one is you can't use it when the skill in question that you want to hold is not already on cooldown. Like if I started holding down my healing skill now, what would happen is that the game would just execute the healing skill immediately and cancel the focus 5. It really only works if you hold something that is currently on cooldown. And the second thing is you need to release the button as soon as the cast of the skill has then started. If you don't release, the game tries to keep doing this skill, and then it will complain again. And actually, due to the command, it sort of gets overworked. I don't know why it actually happens on a technical level, but your character will just go AFK and trap you in a long aftercast of some kind. Actually delays your rotation. So what you can do to avoid this is just release once your skill has started casting, and you can tap 1 or anything else to give it a new command after holding. So you kind of have to be a bit careful with holding that you don't get slowdowns, but when you hold properly, it's really, really good. And the next thing is a word of warning. You can't hold your F5, you can't hold your elite skill because they're instant cast abilities. They will just immediately fire. And if you keep holding them then, you again get those slowdown moments where the game is very confused why you keep inputting a skill that isn't ready. And you can't hold your F1. F1, I think it's because of the ammo that you have, that it sort of gets confused what it means to be on cooldown. So holding really works for dagger 2, dagger 3, and focus 5, and healing skill, and sword 5. And yeah, when you watch the benchmark, maybe you notice whenever this skill recharging message pops up, it's because I've been holding a button that wasn't ready. And it allows me to not cancel a single auto hit, which is obviously a good idea and like gains you DPS to not do that. When I look at benchmark logs and compare it to someone who's learning it, I often see until the very end, until people get really high numbers, I see about 1000 DPS worth of cancelled auto hits in the end. So like finishing properly auto hits, maybe using this holding technique has potential to boost your DPS by 1000. All right, that's one thing. Second thing you have to be careful about is, I talked about slowdown already, but especially on classes where you have flip over chains from auto attacks. So not always the same auto attack, but like a melee weapon that has hammer 1, hammer 2, hammer 3, like 3-part chains. There you get more slowdowns if you hold. So if I held dagger 2 on a different class with a flip over, it would actually slow down the auto attack chain. So this is maybe something that's only useful on Condition Virtuoso, this tech, or maybe only on classes that don't really have proper auto attack chains. You have to be careful. Go look into logs. If holding down gives you slowdowns, you can look at the cast times you get and see if you got slowed down. Yeah, just a word of warning for that. Now, next thing has to do with the cast time of auto attacks and also cast time of dagger 2 and dagger 3. You see, after 320 milliseconds, so the auto attack has 440 millisecond cast time. After 320 milliseconds, nothing you do can stop this auto attack from happening. It is going to execute. You can even press a different skill. You can press your healing skill, your F3, whatever, and it is not going to stop that auto attack from happening. What is going to happen is it's not a time gain. You're not gaining the difference. So you're not gaining 120 milliseconds. What you are going to gain, however, is you have 320 milliseconds of the cast, and then you're kind of stuck 120 milliseconds where your character does nothing. And then after, you perfectly queue up your F3, basically. This is what happens in the frame I've paused at here. So using this F3 a bit early, bites into the previous cast, and then you make sure that you don't get a new cancelled auto hit. So it can be beneficial to press your skills slightly early after auto attacks. At least 320 milliseconds you have to wait though. Don't go earlier than that. And then you can eat into the casts, basically. You up. If you're holding keys, you will always go for the full 440 milliseconds of the auto attack, and then the key, the new skill is attached to the end of that. Now, there's one detail to it, to biting into this aftercast, of the skill, is after 400 milliseconds exactly. If you use F3, 400 milliseconds into the cast of the auto attack, then you actually cut off the aftercast. So you actually gain those 40 milliseconds. So if you press after 320 milliseconds or after 360 milliseconds, you don't gain the time. You're stuck in an aftercast for the full duration that is remaining. But if you hit exactly the 40 millisecond window at 400 milliseconds, if you hit exactly that time perfectly of the server tick where you input your next key, you can actually cut off the casting time of auto attacks. And this is a DPS gain, obviously, because you're spending less time doing an auto attack. It increases DPS. That's quite obvious. The problem is that there's no way to tell whether you managed to do that or whether you were 40 milliseconds early or 40 milliseconds late. Like, okay, you can look at it in log, but live, when you play, there's no way to tell the difference. And so for this reason, every time you do the golem, your cooldowns can align slightly differently. For example, here, you see I'm going to cast my dagger 2. Dagger 2 has a cast time of half a second, roughly. And my dagger 3 is up in roughly half a second. And I have no idea whether that means the dagger 3 is ready at the end of the cast of the dagger 2 or not. So if I was someone trying to input dagger 3 perfectly, I would be in trouble because I can't tell whether I need to do another auto attack after this dagger 2 in order to not waste time, or if I need to press dagger 3. There's no way to tell. So by holding dagger 3 here, the game decides for me, and the game decides at the perfect server tick rate, right? So at the end of this dagger 2, the game will see, oh, dagger 3 is not ready yet. So I do an auto attack now. And this is literally 40 milliseconds off, right? I'll do an auto attack now. And this auto attack is fully executed. I'm holding the key, but the game ignores my dagger 3 until it's done with this auto attack. So because I wasn't sure which aftercasts before I've cancelled by how much and how much I've eaten into auto attacks before, the lineup of the cooldowns here can change. And holding the key allows me to not have to make a decision myself and just let the game decide which is optimal. So this is a very nuanced thing, and it's about 40 milliseconds. And obviously, this is only relevant for the last percentage of the golem, but it's still useful to know. Just like the auto attacks with their 320 millisecond cutoff, the same thing actually happens for Dagger 2 and Dagger 3. For these abilities, let's maybe see it here. For these abilities, you have actually 240 milliseconds of a cutoff. So after 240 milliseconds, no matter what you do, the cast will still finish. And what I can do here is I'm casting my Dagger 2, which doesn't have a cast bar, so it's basically impossible to tell when 240 milliseconds are up. But yeah, you have to deal with it. Once you do that Dagger 2, you can weapon swap without cancelling the Dagger 2. And this now also traps you for the remaining cast duration, 200 milliseconds, inside an aftercast of Dagger 2, where you can't do other things. You can't gain this time. However, by weapon swapping early, we have the unique opportunity, basically, to use this sword 5 as perfectly as possible. Because you see, after you weapon swap, due to your ping, I have a ping of 33 right now, due to your ping, you have a delay on how fast you can input the next skill. So by trapping myself into 200 milliseconds of an aftercast, after I swap the weapon, this gives my computer and my ping time to catch up, and I can actually sword 5 perfectly queued after the Dagger 2. So there's not a big gap between the Dagger 2 use and the sword 5 use, but it's just queued seamlessly. And so I use this weapon swap window here, by swapping early, I use this deliberately to improve the queuing of the sword 5 after. And this is just another of these details. And you can do the same with your healing ability. You can use a healing ability to eat into Dagger 2 and Dagger 3. You can also eat into your Focus 5 cast, but only by 40 milliseconds. If you eat more, it can cause trouble. And then finally, there's the Sword 5 situation. Sword 5 is in two parts. It has 880 milliseconds full cast. After 720 milliseconds, the Phantasmal is spawned. So at that moment, you could swap weapon to cancel the rest. This just gains you the time. But you lose the physical strike of the skill. So what I try to do is instead aim for 800 milliseconds. At 800 milliseconds, you do the full strike, and you can then swap weapon, which is very good. But you can also wait until 880 milliseconds. This is just 80 milliseconds wasted. This is a bit of a problem, right? So I'd like to swap after 800 milliseconds. The Sword 5 also has some sort of weird aftercast. Like after I swapped weapon, you don't immediately start attacking again. But just like Dagger 2 and Dagger 3, swapping early, so after 800 milliseconds to get the physical strike, still gains you a good queuing opportunity of the Focus 5, because you're trapped in an aftercast for a bit, and this allows you the time to queue up the next skill. Alright, now I spoke a lot about a few different millisecond tricks. Sometimes I do them also in real encounters. But in real encounters, I also found myself like, sometimes I have different things to do. And I still think it's good to develop some kind of muscle memory that allows you to go for relatively precise tricks. And especially with the holding of keys. And if you just remember to Dagger 1 and release the keys as well, you can gain a lot even in real encounters. And where you can't be that precise with 40 milliseconds input, and you can greatly reduce the number of cancelled auto hits to hopefully gain a lot of damage for yourself. just by executing more auto attacks fully. One final thing I want to say is that there's a situation at the end. Now that we've talked a bit about variability in the rotation, like not every single golem bench I do looks exactly the same. Sometimes there's one extra auto attack before a dagger 2 or something, which shifts some timing. So at the end, we have this situation where you use the last healing ability here, even though the weapon swap is ready already. So swapping faster earlier, like if we prioritize sword 5 a bit more, if we didn't complete certain auto attacks, like you could speed up the rotation before this point. But if our plan was all along to wait here for the Signet of the Ether into focus 5 again, weapon swapping perfectly off cooldown loses a tiny bit of its importance. And this actually makes the rotation more forgiving. Like the timing is more forgiving. I feel like playing this golem ending where you do this waiting period here at the end with another Signet and focus 5 actually makes the rotation easier to execute because it makes it less important before to be fast, and it gives you more leeway, and you can complete auto attacks. You can do an extra auto attack to gain an extra blade sometimes if the blade production didn't work out, something like that. So things can go wrong, and at the end you're not losing any damage for it. So this makes this ending quite forgiving. There would be a different ending, and you could play different endings if the golem had more health here. For example, if the golem had 20% health at that point, it might be better to instead swap to the sword and use sword 5, Signet of the Ether, sword 5 there. That would be a possible solution. Or if the golem had still 50% health, it would be better to swap the Signet of the Ether, skip the Signet of the Ether, and just swap weapon without waiting at all. But both of these things, if you don't wait here on the weapon swap, obviously makes it less forgiving timing-wise. But it comes up in practice a lot, actually. For example, if you face a fight with 3 minutes of a phase, like Desmina, or which can even take longer in pugs, at some point, you have the Signet of Ether has shifted towards the end of the focus set, and the best advice is to just skip it once, so it moves back to the start of the focus set, you know? This thing has a 25-second cooldown. Your loops only take 22 seconds, so this shifts further and further back. And at a certain point, it's at the end, and rather than overstaying here, if you do that again and loop around again, and we overstay again, we would start getting 25-second loops rather than 22-second loops. And this costs us a lot of damage because you start using your sword 5 less often. So yeah, there are real situations where you play this differently here, where you don't wait, where you just skip over to the sword, and just to get the Signet of the Ether to the start of the focus set again. All right, now that I think this video has been long enough, I will end it here. I highly recommend that you watch the opening guide to really get a deeper look at the opening and start practicing there. And from then on, you can now, using this video as well, understand what's going on with the decision making, and you hopefully can make good choices for yourself when you play it, and you can learn about the rotation. I've always wanted to make this video more about the why of a rotation, so I went through the effort of really explaining every single cooldown collision, explaining why I'm choosing a certain skill over another. I realized that this makes it more complicated, but it is something that people often ask for. They ask me to explain why the rotation works, rather than just prescribing it. So yeah, be careful what you wish for. Here you have it. Thanks for watching, and have a nice day.